The apartment smelled of mildew and cold radiator metal, and the faint alkaline residue of someone else's cooking that had worked itself into the walls long before Cordelia Voss arrived. She was 18 years old, and she had $14.73 in a checking account that had not received a deposit in 11 days, and she was not dramatic about either of these facts. She sat at a card table her grandmother had owned, a folding thing with a gray laminate top, worn pale at the corners, and she cross-referenced a community college financial aid denial letter against a spreadsheet she had built herself. The columns were precise. Her handwriting in the margins was unreadable to anyone but her, which was fine, because no one else read her margins. Below the apartment, a diesel engine cycled inside the parking structure. The sound came up through the floor in low, even pulses, the closest thing to company she had managed since the memorial service 6 weeks ago. Genevieve Voss had died in early September. Cordelia had driven 4 hours to attend a service held in a funeral home that smelled of carnations and forced warmth, and she had sat in a folding chair at the back because the front rows were already occupied by the people who had always occupied front rows. Drummond Alcott and his younger brother Whitfield, her grandmother's nephews, both of them in dark wool suits that had been pressed that morning. She had watched them receive condolences for 40 minutes before driving home. 4 days later, a typed letter arrived. It informed her that the primary assets of Genevieve Voss's estate had been allocated in accordance with the deceased's most recent legal instrument. The phrase appeared 3 times. Cordelia read it 3 times and noticed both things. What arrived for her from the estate was a craft envelope. Inside, a brass key on a red cotton lanyard, small, worn smooth at the bow, with a 4-digit number stamped into the shank that did not correspond to any lock-set format she recognized. Her name was written on the envelope in her grandmother's hand, not typed. The letters tilted slightly forward, certain of where they were going. She had not opened it. She had been looking at it for 6 days, because she was not someone who acted before she understood something, and she did not yet understand this. The diesel engine stopped. The building went quiet in the specific way buildings do when the one persistent sound inside them finally ceases. Her phone rang with a Pennsylvania area code she did not recognize, and she answered it because Cordelia Voss answered things she did not yet understand. West Chester, Pennsylvania holds its history the way old stone holds cold, not as ornament but as fact. The building on Gay Street where Attorney Osi kept her 3rd-floor offices had been standing since 1791, and its brick facade did not acknowledge the 21st century so much as permit it. The stairwell smelled of plaster dust and lemon oil, and the accumulated gravity of 200 years of documents changing hands. Drummond Alcott was already seated when Cordelia arrived. He wore a charcoal cashmere overcoat that he had not removed, and on his left wrist, a watch her grandmother had once pointed to in a magazine and described with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime reading people accurately. Men who wear that watch, Genevieve had said, believe they've already won. Whitfield Alcott arrived 4 minutes later. His cologne entered before he did. He carried an Italian leather briefcase under one arm and a tablet under the other. Its screen opened to a commercial real estate dashboard, populated with parcels, valuations, and zoning classifications rendered in clean sans-serif type. He set the tablet on the table without closing it. He did not look at Cordelia. Neither of them did. They acknowledged her the way people acknowledge a chair they have decided not to sit in. Attorney Osi read the instruments in sequence, without editorial. Through the primary instrument, already executed and distributed, Drummond Alcott had received 11.4 acres of certified commercial zoned land in Newcastle County, appraised at $247,000, plus liquid assets totaling $89,600. Whitfield Alcott had received a parcel of equivalent acreage and a matching liquid distribution. These facts were stated. They were not celebrated in the room because they did not need to be. The secondary instrument conveyed to Cordelia Voss the deeded title to 1 Fieldstone Cottage and the 1.7 acres surrounding it in rural Chester County, along the Brandywine Creek. The county parcel record showed no commercial zoning classification, no assessed structure value above $14,000, no subdivision ineligibility under current municipal code, The Alcott's legal team had reviewed it, and formally assigned it a market value of 0. Drummond leaned back in his chair with the patience of a man explaining arithmetic to a child and said, "At least you'll have somewhere to store things." The room did not laugh. It did not need to. Cordelia looked at the deed. Then she looked at the brass key in her lap. Small, worn, smooth at the bow, its 4-digit number stamped into the shank, meaning nothing she could yet name. When she reached her car, she finally opened the envelope. 4 lines. Her grandmother's handwriting, tilted forward certain. She read them twice, looked up at the parking garage ceiling, and read them once more. They told her nothing. They told her everything. Chester County in late October. Smells of cold creek water and decomposing oak, and the faint petroleum residue of farm roads that have not seen fresh asphalt in 30 years. Cordelia drove northeast from Coatesville with the windows cracked because the defroster ran hot and uneven, and the smell came in steadily. Organic, cold, indifferent to her arrival. The car was a 2009 Civic with 112,000 miles on it, and a rear bumper held by 2 cable ties she had installed herself, with a YouTube tutorial and a pair of pliers. She had $31.40 in her wallet after fuel. She had her grandmother's note on the passenger seat unfolded, the 4 lines visible, without her having to read them again. The GPS lost signal at a bend in the county road marked by a rusted mailbox with no number on it. She continued on the note's instructions. Stone wall, then left, then follow the creek sound. The Brandywine was audible before she could see it, a low, persistent movement through the tree line. The sound of water that has been cutting the same path through the same limestone for longer than any record she could access. The cottage appeared through a gap in the trees and was worse than she had allowed herself to expect. The east end of the roof had partially collapsed inward, leaving a dark triangle of exposed sky above the rafters. She sat in the car for a moment before she got out. The smell that reached her when she opened the door was cold ash and wet limestone, and something beneath both, older, mineral, sealed. The front door was warped in its frame and required both hands and her full weight to open. Inside, the temperature cold, sealed cold, the kind of cold that belongs to a space that has been closed for a long time. She stood in the main room and listened. The creek ran 40 yards to the north. The floorboards beneath her were wide and desiccated, and when she shifted her weight, they did not creak. They resonated, a low, lateral knock that moved through the boards sideways rather than down, the way sound moves when there is nothing solid beneath it. She thought about leaving. She calculated it honestly. $31, no return deposit, no trajectory that did not route through this specific property on this specific afternoon. She stayed because of the note, because of the handwriting on the envelope, tilted, certain, unafraid. Because she was constitutionally incapable of walking away from a thing she had not yet understood. She found a lantern in the front room, half full. She carried it to the north room and held it near the baseboard of the north wall. The flame bent toward the wall. The single cracked window was to her right. There was no draft. There was no reason for the flame to move in the direction it was moving. She was already on her knees with her ear against the floor before she had consciously decided to kneel. She pressed her palms against the fieldstone of the north wall and felt, beneath the cold of the limestone, the faint give of something stone should not have. A vertical seam ran floor to ceiling, too straight for age, too deliberate for accident. She worked her fingers along it until she found the edge. The wall swung inward on a pivot hinge so old it did not squeak as much as exhale, a long low release, and finally permitted to speak. The smell came first. Cedar oil and old paper, and something beneath both, heavier, mineral, the specific density of metal held in an enclosed space for decades. The temperature dropped. Not the damp cold of the cottage, but dry, preserved cold. The cold of things kept on purpose. She stepped through 7 feet deep, packed earth floor. Limestone walls fitted without mortar. Along the right wall stood 11 flat cedar boxes, each sealed with a brass clasp, stacked with the care of someone who organized things they expected another person to one day find. On the left wall, mounted on iron brackets at eye level, hung a document frame, glass intact. She turned to the boxes first. The brass key fit a secondary clasp on the third box from the bottom, machined to match the key's bow exactly. two things made for each other in the same year inside. Parchment documents folded in thirds, each sealed with red wax faded to the color of old brick. She opened the topmost one at its seams, and Chester County, Pennsylvania, dated 1792, signed by George Washington, conveying 212 acres along the west branch of the Brandywine Creek to one Elias Voss. She opened the remaining boxes in sequence and read the chain of title document by document. At the bottom of the final box lay a hand-drawn survey map dated 1926, showing boundary markers at measured intervals across the full 212 acres. Iron stakes. She had walked past them that afternoon and taken them for old fence posts. They had been in that ground for 97th box, noticeably, immediately heavier, the weight shifting toward the bottom the moment she lifted it from the stack. Inside the documents, wrapped in a square of oilcloth tied with waxed linen cord, was a cloth pouch. She untied it carefully. Inside the pouch, arranged in 4 rows on a folded piece of flannel, were 23 gold sovereign coins, British issue, each one the size of a thumbnail, warm-colored even in lantern light, each face bearing the profile of a monarch whose reign had ended before Nora Voss was born. She held one between her fingers. It was solid in the way that very few things are solid, dense, certain, indifferent to the century that had passed since someone placed it there. On the oilcloth, in Nora Voss's handwriting, 4 words, for whoever needs it first. Nora Voss had converted her family's savings into gold sovereigns in 1928. She had not trusted paper. She had trusted metal and earthens. She had trusted metal and earth, and a room no one else knew existed. The coins were not the inheritance. They were the provision. The thing meant to carry whoever found this place through the first difficult months, before the larger truth could be proven and filed and confirmed. Nora Voss had thought of everything. She crossed to the document frame. The letter behind the glass was dated 1928, written in a hand economical and unnecessary, the script of someone who wrote only what was necessary. The author was Nora Voss. It did not begin with grief. It began with a document reference number. Nora Voss had discovered, in 1927, that the county's 1906 consolidation survey had transposed 212 acres into 1.7 through a clerical error in a single ledger column. No Voss alive at the time had the capital to contest it. She assembled the proof over 1 year and sealed it here because she did not trust the institutions of 1928 with documents of this age and consequence. The stock market proved her right 11 months later. The letter named the federal land patent as the controlling instrument. It gave one instruction: contact the National Archives in Philadelphia and the Chester County Recorder of Deeds simultaneously and file under the original patent number before any other action. It ended with 6 words. This belongs to whoever is patient. Cordelia did not move. She thought about the County Planning Commission minutes she had read 8 months ago. 3 municipal infrastructure projects, stalled for 11 years along the Brandywine corridor. Easement acquisition rights described in one dry paragraph that no one without a reason would have found. Those rights exceeded $14 million. She had known that number before today. She had not known, before today, that the land was hers. She was still kneeling, the gold coin still between her fingers, when she heard tires on the gravel outside, then a second set, then a car door closing with the dense, weighted sound of German engineering. Something expensive, handled by someone accustomed to expensive things. She placed the coin back on the flannel. She closed the 7th box. She closed the 3rd box. She pressed the partition into its frame until the seam disappeared. She carried the lantern to the front room, put her back against the interior wall, and stood in the dark, listening. Drummond Alcott did not drive himself. The first vehicle was a black SUV, and it carried a man named Gideon Price, whose screen displayed satellite thermal imaging of the cottage structure, color-mapped, annotated, professionally rendered. Price worked for a Chester County land acquisition firm the Alcott family had retained for 9 years. The thermal survey had been contracted after their original digital appraisal, flagged the property as a potential teardown site along a pipeline and easement corridor, that 3 municipal parcels post companies had been quietly assembling across for 11 years. They had known what this land abutted before the ink on the secondary instrument was dry. Drummond arrived in the second vehicle. He stepped out in the same cashmere overcoat, and he did not look surprised to find Cordelia's car in the gravel. He looked the way people look when they find precisely what they expected. He told her, standing in the doorway of the cottage she legally owned, that the secondary instrument was being contested, a procedural deficiency in its execution. His attorney had filed a motion in Chester County Orphans Court at 9 o'clock that morning. The deficiency was real. A notary seal dated 3 days after the signing, a discrepancy common in estates executed by elderly testators but actionable under Pennsylvania law in specific circumstances. Drummond's attorney had found it in 4 hours. She had 72 hours to vacate and surrender the property. Pitting Cordelia listened. She did not argue. She did not reach for the deed in her bag or the key in her pocket. She asked one question. She asked Price whether the thermal imaging equipment had detected any subsurface anomalies during the structural survey. Price and Drummond exchanged a look. Brief, calibrated, the look of two people deciding how much to give away. No, Price said. See, imaging is a surface tool. It does not map below the foundation line. Cordelia nodded. Then back at Drummond Alcott. She said she would need the 72 hours to remove her belongings. Drummond accepted this the way he accepted most things, as confirmation of what he had already decided was true. He nodded at Price. Price produced a business card with the court filing reference number printed below his firm's logo and held it out. Cordelia took it with both hands. The way her grandmother had taught her to receive things, Drummond turned back toward his SUV. Without looking at her, in the same measured tone he used for everything that did not require his full attention, he said, "You always were the quiet one." The gravel shifted under his shoes. Both vehicles reversed down the path and disappeared behind the tree line. Cordelia stood in the doorway until the sound of the engines faded into the creak noise. Then she looked down at the business card. Then she looked at the place on the cottage floor where the partition seam was no longer visible. The thermal imaging had mapped every surface of this structure. It had found nothing below the foundation line, because it could not see below the foundation line. Drummond Alcott had sent the most sophisticated assessment tool available to a property appraiser in Chester County, and it had looked directly above 98 years of concealed documentation and 23 gold sovereign coins and reported nothing unusual. She had 69 hours. She already knew exactly what she was going to do with them. She did not hire an attorney. She could not afford an attorney. What she had was a cedar box, a federal land patent signed by George Washington, 11 boxes of chain of title documentation, and a hand-drawn survey map from 1926 with iron boundary stakes notated at measured intervals across 212 acres. She carried all of it into the Chester County Recorder of Deeds office when the doors opened and asked to file under an original patent number. The clerk at the intake window was a woman named Darlene, who had worked there for 23 years. Darlene looked at the 1792 patent for 45 seconds without speaking. Then she picked up her phone and called her supervisor. The supervisor called the county solicitor's office. Cordelia was given a number and directed to a plastic chair against the wall, and she sat in it for 4 hours and 40 minutes. At 3:47 in the afternoon, the Chester County Solicitor's Office issued an emergency administrative hold on the Orphans Court motion pending review of a potential superior title instrument. Drummond Alcott's 72-hour clock stopped before it reached the courthouse. His attorney called him. Cordelia was not in the room for that conversation, but she learned later that the attorney's first words were a number of acres. The second thing the attorney said was the words federal patent. Attorney Petra Osi called Drummond Alcott at 5:15. She was not unkind, she was precise. She told him that a valid chain of title originating in a federal land patent supersedes any County Pennsylvania in Pennsylvania under established precedent. She told him the 212 acres described in the original patent were pending final court review, the controlling document for the Voss parcel. She told him the notarial deficiency in the secondary instrument was now moot. because the secondary instrument was not the document in question. The document in question predated Pennsylvania's county recording system by 11 years. The defeat did not happen in a dramatic room. It happened in a parking garage in Westchester at 5:17 in the afternoon. Drummond Alcott stood beside his German SUV in his cashmere overcoat, holding his phone, and said nothing for 31 seconds. Petra Ozzie remained on the line. Darlene, who had clocked out at the end of her shift and parked 2 levels up in the same structure, walked past him on her way to her car. She told Cordelia about it afterward. She said he looked like a man who had just discovered that the floor beneath the entire house was not what it appeared to be. Cordelia received the news by text, sitting in her car in the National Archives parking lot. She read the message. She set the phone face down on the passenger seat and looked through the windshield at the concrete wall in front of her. Drummond Alcott had sent thermal imaging equipment, commercial appraisers, and a legal team to a property his databases had assessed at $14,000. Every tool he trusted had looked directly above 98 years of concealed documentation and found nothing. He had been defeated not by luck or rescue or anything he could have anticipated. He had been defeated by the specific limit of the systems he had never once thought to question. She said it quietly, to no one, to the empty car. You always had somewhere to store things. You just never thought to look below the floor. She drove back to the cottage in the dark, parked in the gravel, and sat for a moment in the cold. Then she opened the door, walked inside, lit the lantern, and began to read the rest of the documents from the beginning. The Chester County Court of Common Pleas confirmed the quiet title action in Cordelia Voss's name 14 months later. The 212 acres along the Brandywine Creek corridor were legally restored to the Voss family deed under the original federal patent, with Cordelia named as sole successor in interest. 3 infrastructure companies, whose easement negotiations had been stalled for 11 settlement for right-of-way access rights, totaling $16,430,000, paid over 7 years. Attorney Petra Ozzie, who had taken the case on contingency after examining the patent documentation, received her percentage. Cordelia received the rest. Drummond Alcott's contested motion was dismissed with prejudice. The commercial real estate database his firm had used to value the property at $14,000 was cited in the court's written opinion as an example of the limits of automated parcel assessment tools in counties with pre-federal survey histories. His name appeared in that opinion 4 times. He did not contest the quiet title ruling. There was nothing left to contest. Whitfield Alcott liquidated his inherited parcel 6 months after the ruling and relocated. Both cousins were reduced, in the public record, to footnotes in a case about a key and a flaw. The 23 gold sovereign coins were authenticated by a numismatic specialist in Philadelphia. British issue, minted between 1872 and 1910, each one in exceptional condition given their storage. Their combined appraised value was $31,400. It was not a fortune. It was exactly what Nora Voss had intended it to be, enough to carry someone through the first difficult months before the larger truth could be proven. Cordelia used it to cover the filing fees, the travel costs, and 4 months of rent while the quiet title action moved through the court. Nora Voss had calculated correctly across 96 years. Cordelia used the first settlement distribution to subsidiary Nora Genevieve Voss Endowment, a land Chester County Historical Society, filing of affordable, funding the across Chester, and filing overlooked pre-federal land claims across Chester, Lancaster, and Dastawar counties where database errors had quietly reduced documented acreage without the original holder's knowledge. The first cohort of fellows began work in a building she rented 2 blocks from the Recorder of Deeds office. She was 19 years old. On the morning the endowment opened, the kitchen smelled of cedar and clean stone. Eastern light came through the window above the counter. On the desk in the next document on top the chain of document she had read through twice since October, sat a small brass key on a red cotton lanyard, and beside it, 1 gold sovereign coin she had kept, not for its value, but because Nora Voss had placed it there for whoever needed it first. and Cordelia believed in honoring the intention of the people who had thought of her before she arrived. What was buried was not gold, it was the record of what was always true. And the only difference between the woman who found it and the men who missed it was that she was willing to get down on her knees and listen to what the floor was telling her. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more hidden fortune and inheritance stories. Thanks for watching.